Hello and welcome to another video on this channel. Today we are indeed talking about cinema Paradiso, love, nostalgia, and faith. I think these are three themes which are very strong in cinema Paradiso, and I know you can indeed see Warren Drew right now, who actually has frozen. We were talking so long about how Wi-Fi wasn't going to be a problem for once, and now his Wi-Fi has completely frozen out. However, I hope you are going to enjoy this video. It's going to be interesting discussion. And Warren Drew, if you can actually hear me, how are you? I think he has completely frozen. But nevertheless, I can start off with saying that there are three things that we're going to be talking about, I would say. Not only in the idea of love, nostalgia, and also, okay, he is completely disconnected now. That's even better, I suppose. But love, nostalgia, and faith, I think, can be all separated into three themes, which is infancy, the youth, and maturity. And I think that this is something which is found very beautifully in Cinema Paradiso. And that is something we're going to be talking about. Warren Drew has rejoined us and has frozen.
Yeah, this is a complete parallel of Cinema Paradiso, of the nostalgia coming back.
Indeed. Not only is it frozen in the past, I think that's an interesting thing. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, that's good enough then.
How are you, Jufu Chung?
I'm great. What were you saying just then in the introduction?
Well, I was saying that Cinema Paradiso, there are three themes which play a significant role in it, which is love and nostalgia. And I think that as I was pondering about love and nostalgia, I figured out that faith can be viewed in a very, very similar fashion as well. And in some sense, the view of faith should be one which is viewed through nostalgia and love, which is a structure which is presented quite well in Cinema Paradiso, and something that I was going to talk to you about. It was something that we touched upon in the past, and I think we could touch upon it deeper in the present.
So what's here the link between faith, love, and nostalgia?
Well, I think the first way to look at it is to look at love and nostalgia in Cinema Paradiso, because I think that by understanding the dynamic between the two, we are able then to say, well, actually, this structure which is being presented actually looks very similar to that of faith, especially the faith of Paul, where he talks about the justification and the failure of the justification of works. Now, I think that what I was thinking about Cinema Paradiso, and this is one thing I've talked about in the past as well, what on earth does the story mean when of course Alfredo tells the kid to say, well, stand under the balcony for 100 days, and then maybe the object of love will reciprocate the love, and it seems very ridiculous, right? Because you in the story, at least, the knight, the random soldier, wants to marry a princess, and as a result, he just stands underneath the balcony. The father says, well, if you stand underneath the balcony for 100 days, well, that would show your commitment. And it's a very perplexing story, because how on earth is just standing under a balcony for 100 days a commitment of any imagination of love? But at the same time, it seems that, well, how on earth does it work? But at the same time, it does work in the movie, and it does work in the story as well. And that was something which puzzled me for after I watched the movie, and that's been something which has been on my mind for a very long time.
This reminds me of something. So in the Bible, Jesus said that be like little children, else you won't be able to go to the kingdom of heaven. And it seems like here there's logic of little children logic happening, where this is immense faith in the power of faith and commitment and courage and in the goodness of the world, where as long as I commit to something, it will carry on and go on and finish, and I will achieve what I need to do as long as I do the requisite things. That and another thing is, did we talk about this before? Because I remember it was like one time where it was like 2-3 a.m. in the morning, and we were like half naked, lying not on the same bed, and it was like just chatting. And you told me something about this that was really profound, but I completely forgot.
Indeed, I might have told you this before, because I wrote it in my notebooks last night, and then I matched it up, because a dear friend of ours, Sophie, has given us given me a notebook at least, and and I wrote down all my thoughts about it. And then I looked at my old notebook, and I realized I've written the exact same thing on the other notebook before as well. so maybe I haven't. Exactly, that is precisely the fact. And I think that you're tying to Be with Little Children is precisely correct, because I think that the idea of Toto standing underneath the window is precisely that almost a blind faith, or at least this belief in the power of love, so much so that this love is sufficient to overcome everything. And the idea of, and the natural conclusion is that one of be like little children, which is in Matthew 18 verses 3, which tells us to be like little children, and that faith of the size of a mustard seed can indeed move mountains. So there seems to be kind of a connect between those two ideas, and the idea that a faith, which is very simple and very small, not only has a power to, perhaps you would say, not only has a power to overcome all opposition, but perhaps that nature of faith itself is a very juvenile and an infant kind of belief in faith, the form of innocence.
Yeah, and what I even want to stress more is, recently I've been contemplating the relationship between narrative and reality, and a lot of people would criticize sort of these these stories, saying that they're not real, in the sense that reality is one thing, and in this faith that things will happen as long as you put the effort into it is another thing. But that my Hegelian suggestion will be something like, rather than criticizing stories because stories don't match up with reality, why don't we criticize reality because reality does not match the stories, if you get what I mean? So I think it might be more real to base out a fundamental assumption of the real with a capital R on stories and narrative and faith, rather than basing it on reality, which, of course, in reality, if you stand outside a girl's outside a girl's outside a girl's balcony for 100 days, she might not come to you. But maybe in the faith logic, it works, and that's what matters, rather than in reality.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very interesting kind of discussion, because there's this picture which is painted by Nicolas Berdyaev, which is the idea that humans are part, in some sense, like the divine. It's like when you say, well, God created man in his image. Humans are spirit and also part of nature. And that it is that freedom, which is a freedom of myth, perhaps, which is what you call the narrative. And I think that this picture is a very clear one, in some sense, that man is first the spirit. Man is first a being living in the narrative state, and then is a person who from the narrative enters into nature and struggles with nature. And there's this endless kind of clash, which Berdyaev recognizes and labels as tragedy, which is at the heart of the dilemma of choosing between good and evil. Now, my good friend has frozen, and I might have to say the entire thing again, but at least I think that Berdyaev would then, in this circumstance, say, well, goodness is that principle, or tragedy is that principle, in which both principles of good and principles of evil combined and conflict. And in some sense, according to Berdyaev, tragedy is the principle in which goodness itself is conflicted against itself. That is when you have two conditions or properties of good which are in conflict, is the true stem or the true root of a tragedy. And of course, as I'll later develop, this tragedy is precisely what I think love to be, at least love in its mature stage, is precisely a tragedy of its own kind. Now, Warren Ju, I've just presented a long stanza. Have you missed the entirety of it?
I have missed the entirety of it, but it's fine. I got the birthday part. I think everything is fine now. I have finally figured out the problem. I managed to somehow bypass the Chinese firewall now and connect to StreamYard without my VPN, and I think that'll be fine.
Hopefully that is better. I mean, the conflict is, and the moment you said, and the conflict is that, and I was saying, well, man is precisely the person between nature and spirit, and tragedy occurs when it is two principles of good which are in conflict with each other, which is nature and spirit, that both of them are indeed good, but are in conflict. And precisely it is this form of tragedy, which I would say Toto is confronting when he reaches a stage of maturity. And of course, we'll get there later. But before we get there, is there anything else you would like to add based on this kind of dialectic or this discussion?
Yeah, well, I just want to ask, what do you mean by nature? Because I feel like a lot of people have an idea of nature that is not very sophisticated. So we can think about Mother Nature, nature as this all-encompassing goodness. We can say that something is unnatural. Let's say the burning of fossil fuels is unnatural. But then can one criticize something because it's unnatural? I think that's that's incorrect, in that just as we can say that fossil fuels are unnatural according to our, let's say, one conception of nature, under another conception of nature, we can say that the burning of fossil fuels is entirely natural. It's part of the human instinct, and human beings, as part of nature, created it. So I guess I just want you to clarify what nature really means in your conceptual scheme.
According to Berdyaev, nature is something which is way more fundamental, in the sense that nature is precisely that which is of the natural world, not really what is natural in any kind of construct, but rather that which is physical. And in the idea that it is the world of a cloud, it's perhaps a clouded world of being, which is nature, and that God is the being. So when he says, well, man is part of nature and also part of God, the knower is in some sense a divine imago Dei creation, but at the same time he is in a realm of unbeing, a clouded being perhaps. And of course those two are different categories, but this is kind of an element of the world in which a man exists. So I think Warren Jew has frozen again, despite his praising of his ability to break through the firewall, which is quite unfortunate because, well, man, this is unfortunate. Oh well. He said to me, if I stand outside your gates for 100 days, will my VPN be stable? I think you should. I think he should ask President Xi about that. But I mean, this is quite a ridiculous nature of reality.
I am positive that it'll work out.
I think if you stand outside the Forbidden City for 100 days, I think it might work out. And he has frozen.
Okay. Let's continue.
Mm-hmm. Well, so where did you actually cut out? So I'm not sure exactly how much should I have to discuss.
No, just estimate by yourself. I think we'll take it by faith, since we're doing a discussion about faith.
Indeed, and as a result, the natural conclusion is, and perhaps I'll say this distinction is that humans' role is not necessarily, I would say, it's not completely to just trust the narrative over reality, or whatever you want to call reality, but rather trust in man's creative ability, such that he starts off from the narrative, and that the narrative is the only lens through which one can penetrate into reality. Because, of course, in the works of Berdyaev, what he is arguing is that that the act of knowing is not just this idea of this epistemological idea of there's the subject and the object, but rather knowing is an active ability where the object, the subject, the knower, is himself appropriating and taking in the world around him in almost a Heideggerian sense of saying, well, the world of being, to know something is to appropriate that concept into himself. And this is, I think, the concept I was trying to tell you over the text about sex and the I forgot exactly what we were talking about, but that was
because it's in KJV, in the KJV translation of the Bible. When Adam has sex with Eve, they always say he knew Eve. So I think that's what you meant, in that there's a way in which knowledge is corporeal, and not only corporeal, it's this contact between selves where one self is assimilated into another self. And I just want to ask on this note about the Berdyaev theory of knowledge. Is it more? It sounds very solipsistic from what you're saying, or is it possible, let's say, other than maybe knowledge as being you assimilate other things into yourself? Can you be like assimilated by other things, and that can be counted as knowledge?
And that is a very important point, and it's like, and this is the part of what Berdyaev calls his personalistic philosophy, is that although it sounds initially solipsistic, the person who is the knower, the active self of the knowledge, that knower is a person and not an individual. And what he means by this is that to be a person is to enter into a relationship with the divine, the super person, or the super personality. And to have a personality is to understand and experience the not only how a naturalist might say, well, you experience your emotions as stimuli, but to understand the world of being. In order to reach that level of a person, quote unquote person, is precisely to enter into a relationship with other people and other persons, because it's very difficult to have a personality without any other person around them. That is an individual. Just like imagine an animal or a human without any connection with anyone else. That's not a personality. He doesn't have a personality at all. He doesn't have a relationship with other people. It's very weird to say, well, this guy is friendly when there's no friend out there, right? There's no personality. There's no object and subject to relate with each other. And as a result, to view Berdyaev in a solipsistic way is to view humans only as an individual. But rather, Berdyaev says, well, humans fundamentally are persons. And as a result, it is not solipsistic, because in order first to know, to be a person is to be in a world surrounded with other people and other knowers who are also persons.
Mm-hmm. Well, then how does this match up maybe with, because I also know that Kierkegaard has the idea of the single individual. Then how would he place the single individual of Kierkegaard, which is this individual who has the capacity to almost break free of, let's say, his own humanity, of rationality itself, into somewhere super rational and totally human. And that's a single individual and the leap of faith. Because I kind of want to propose, after hearing this distinction between the individual and the person, it might be like something above the person, in that the person might be only the first stage. In translating it into Heidegger speak, something like Dasein in its everydayness, that's the person. And then on top, there may be, there's Dasein in its, Dasein in anxiety, authentic Dasein, or the single individual, who maybe we can call spirit. So we can have this triad of the individual, the person, and the spirit. And that might be, and when you go up to the spirit, somehow you go back to the individual in such a way that your individuality is sublated. Just as going back out to our previous discussion about the child, I feel like the true faith is not necessarily this childish naivety, but rather you start off with this childish naivety of waiting outside, and you go through life. You go through failures. The childish naivety is challenged, and at the end of life, that's when Toto comes back to his hometown. You somehow retain or go back to your childish naivety and stand even more firmly for it, despite the fact that your challenge it has been challenged so much.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting proposition, and perhaps we can put away the Berdyaev distinction in Kierkegaard for a moment and move on to the next stage, which I think is Toto when he's writing love letters, because I think that that's a fundamental shift away, and almost there's this return. Like nostalgia is this idea of return, but not a return in its fullest form. And perhaps in the same way, I think to understand this relationship and what Berdyaev means when he says, well, humans are a person, and what he means by a person, to understand that is perhaps to go through the different stages, as you suggest, of Toto. And in order to do so, let's focus on the few stages of Toto. We've talked a bit about him as a child, and perhaps we can move forward and talk a bit about him as a teenager, and that's when he goes to war, when he's separated from Elena. Because, of course, in the situation is that Toto actually does succeed in being with Elena. But after that situation, what happens is quite tragic, is that he gets sent to war, and he writes loads of letters, but those letters fail. And what that seems to suggest, in some sense, is the idea of fit. It's somewhat the belief that the pure love is insufficient, that faith is insufficient. It's that doubting of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's idea is that the doubting
You
of
go
faith
first, you
isn't
go first.
necessarily a weakness of the faith itself, but rather the weakness of the mode of being in which the faith is being presented. So he's like saying, well, okay, I have this idea of pure love, but then me, myself, am unable to represent that pure love in its actuality. And even though that pure love, that trust in the pure love did work, I now recognize that I am a fallen being, and that fallen being has a gap. And I will now try to make up that gap with writing letters and doing acts. And that is a move away. And that move into the belief of works.
Okay, I don't completely understand. Oh, but so I think it'll be easier for me to understand if we map it onto faith and works in some sense, right? So he starts up with this pure faith. Let's say it's the post-conversion, the moment of crisis, the event that had happened. And what he starts to realize is that pure faith is not enough, because reality is much more complex, and there are just so many different things that can happen to an individual, to a person, that separates himself from the other. And at that point, just that the momentary intensity of faith does not sustain oneself for years on end when you're completely separated. Then you need this kind of works, which is the long struggle to attain a love that is true and has content beyond the form of faith. Would that be a correct characterization?
And I say that would be the teenage state, when he actually believes that works is sufficient to make up for the lack of his faith. I'll say that's teenage state.
Wherein is the lack of his faith? As
in the sense that he is separate, and that Elena does not respond to his messages. And it's that idea that, well, although I love, I can no longer, like, it, although it came first, it has now left again. And despite all the love that I still have, that he is forced away from that initial state, because he recognizes that despite his actions, it is still insufficient. Like, so it's this idea that the man enters into the relationship with the divine, into the faith, right? But then after that, he recognizes, wait a second, I am still sinning a lot. Like, initially, he's like, well, I have so much faith, and that faith is sufficient. And in that belief, he believes that his faith is good. But then after that, he recognizes, wait a second, I'm still a sinful person. And as a result, my sinfulness is an imperfection, which my faith, despite how strong it is, cannot overcome. Because no matter how strong I rely on the faith, the sin is still there, and he still carries out the sin.
Okay, I'm losing a bit of memory in terms of the story in the middle. So how would exactly describe the sin that Toto has in the middle? Because when I think about sin, if we're to match it onto the movie, it would be like he commits maybe acts with thoughts of infidelity. He swindles in terms of his love towards Elena, etc. Rather than maybe I'm thinking that, because what it seems to me here now is that rather than saying that he lost his faith, one can even say that it is a process of faith strengthening that he's going on, because all his efforts, all his works are unrequited. It requires even more faith to continue on with those works. And that's when faith itself becomes pure faith. Because I think true faith isn't faith that knows, after I wait outside for 100 days, I'm going to get the girl. But the faith that knows that even if I don't get the girl, I will still nevertheless do it. And I know something will happen, even though I don't know what will happen.
Well, I think that the faith here in the movie, when we were kind of matching it, should be less be seen as something which is a parallel, but rather something which is identical, such that the object of love is precisely what we call the object of faith in the analysis. Because, and what I mean by that is that faith is not necessarily a part, and this is what I think is what you would call Jungian synchronicity, is that is that faith isn't actually part of the movie at all, but rather that by some work of divine coincidence, and hence the synchronicity, faith can be viewed and illustrated and illuminated precisely through the movie. And that's why I say faith should be seen as identical to love, in the sense that they work under a same structure. And that's why faith is love in some sense. And what I mean by that is that when faith is weakened and hence sin arises, that is the same to love being lost, or at least not reciprocated. And it is in that sense that the love is insufficient.
I want to disagree here, because this sort of defies my conception of faith and works, in that I think the analogy to love, if we're completely to map, I would call the beloved sort of the object of faith, or the process of love as a process of the switching between faith and works, rather than love being faith itself. In that, if we're thinking about it in relation to the story, let me think a bit. I'd say that the problem here is we got love on one hand, and the thing is that he loves. Okay. I kind of get what I'm trying to say now. When he leaves, he sort of loses his love. But then I don't see how losing your love, because losing your love is not of your own doing. So sin, in my conception, is of your own doing. So I wouldn't equate losing your love with sin, but rather I would say losing your love as a further test of your faith, as this objective circumstance that is outside of one's control, which requires extraordinary faith for one to power through. Sort of like when you have Abraham and Isaac, and then God tells Abraham to hit Isaac, to kill Isaac. I think it's a similar thing here when you lose the love, rather than losing the love as a part of sin. I say losing the love as a part of the strengthening of faith from its naivety to its maturity. So maybe becoming a person in faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily something I'm going to disagree with. However, I would like to suggest that the belief in the, well, I think you have to look at the where does the desire or the thought that one needs works arises from, because of course there's a distinction between Luther and the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church says, well, let's do penance, let's do all of these stuff to make up for sin. And sin, in some sense, is a departure from faith. And a Luther would say is that well, stop doing all these penances. That's a complete separation from the true nature of faith. And in that sense, I would say that love is perhaps love itself, the teenager, and this is why it's which is an incorrect view. I would say precisely, I would agree with you that this view is incorrect, but it is a natural stage that one takes when they start recognizing that love is insufficient, at least in the physical sense. In the same way that the Catholics, as one of the first formulations of Christianity, perhaps, is an insufficient and incorrect view, but nevertheless is a necessary, or at least a reasonable view, which is the recognition that, well, there are problems with our expression of faith, which is sin. And as a result, we need to try to make up for that sin, which is the penances, the acts, the works. And the same way, this is the gift giving and the writing of the letters, in a way to make up the apparent making up of the lack of faith.
Okay, and if we're to map it onto the movie, then what is the problem with this approach, and what's the sort of the dialectical synthesis that leads it to the next stage?
The dialectical synthesis is that he recognizes that this is a tragedy, because there's nothing necessarily wrong with doing good works, and there's also nothing necessarily wrong for loving in its purest form. But he recognizes that both fail, because he writes his letters and still loses Elena, at the end, and he also at the first point loses Elena when his love was insufficient. So in both situations, despite both being good, he fails, which is, I would say, the highest tragedy, because that the tragedy, which people normally say is a conflict between good and evil. But the greatest tragedy is a conflict between two principles of good, but both principles of good fail utterly, and as a result, it is totally tragic.
I like it. I like it. That's very Warrenian.
I think that is the conclusion, which moves it to the final stage,
What's the final stage?
which is the nostalgia, and that is the idea that it is an acceptance that all things are failure, and that one must return to its initial state, but not necessarily. And that's a very interesting thing, is that you naturally, when you look at both failed options and you recognize that both are insufficient, you recognize that at least in its purity, the faith or the love, in theory at least, was sufficient, and as a result, the nostalgia returns as a nature of nostalgia to the past and says, well, okay, maybe I will not be able to carry out in its totality, but at least I will attempt to live in that world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would challenge you here. I can hear a very strong objection in that. Why wouldn't be one of the approaches saying something like, let's say, it's the dignity of the dignity of tragedy. This approach would be something like, even though this is tragic, and we have two principles of good that collides with each other, and there's no clear way out. We can either do works or we can go for faith. Both sides are right, but you lose your love no matter where you go. Can't we say that? Can't we still affirm one of those paths and say, even though let's say we're doing faith, even though I know faith alone will not allow me to attain love, nonetheless I accept this fate that love shall not be attained, and I will continue on my own path. And I think this is a certain dignity to it, the kind of dignity of a losing general who refuses to back down and sort of just rushes into the battlefield and gets killed. And I'd say that might be, one could argue that might be a better option than this kind of nostalgic return, which one could even say is illusory. Although I would need to hear you talk more about your option first.
Or perhaps I would say that this is precisely the object of faith, is that the story doesn't end in nostalgia. Rather, it is that recognition and the acceptance of the initial faith that leads the other to return in a physical sense. In the sense of, this is the idea of the return of the Holy Spirit to be with humans forever, is that faith which brings forth the return. And that even though it accepts even though you accept one's insufficiencies in the first idea of faith, you also recognize that it is absolutely necessary. And by committing to it, that is the doctrine of grace, whereas despite your insufficiency, the other accepts it and enters into the life. And that love is a similar sense.
And maybe the thing that provides you the courage to carry on despite the tragedy is the Holy Spirit, or something like that.
Yes.
And I didn't understand the last bit of what you were talking about in your last speech. I don't know, discussion, proposition of, so we got love and works, and we got the tragedy, and then what was the solution inside the movie, or in your view, of this tragedy?
Well, I think the solution to the tragedy is not necessarily to deny the tragedy, because it is no matter what you choose. And in some sense, nostalgia is, as the objection that you rose, the nostalgia is precisely the choosing of the former, the faith, over the latter, and saying that will be sufficient. And in some sense, the tragic is to be viewed as an element or a part of that faith. In the same way that Berdyaev would say, well, tragedy is an element of ethics, such that you cannot view humans merely as good and evil, but rather humans are good, evil, and tragic, such that the entrance of good and evil is to also already accept the existence of tragedy. And in the same way, you would say that perhaps that tragedy is not necessarily removed. It is the maturity allows acceptance of the tragedy, and also
Hmm.
recognizes the tragedy, but at the same time returns to the faith,
How does it return to the faith?
in the sense of the recognition that the faith should be sufficient, regardless of all its insufficiencies, its physical insufficiencies.
And how would that manifest in relation to nostalgia in the movie?
Well, in the movie, and this is where the extended cut comes in. Supposedly, there's the extended cut, which I haven't actually watched, but allegedly, in this extended cut, Alfredo returns to the town and then recognizes that the reason why Elena didn't reach out to him was, well, actually, no, Toto returns to the town and realizes the reason why Elena didn't reach out to him was because Alfredo told her that she would only distract Toto from the dream. So as a result, Toto goes and finds Elena and actually meets up with her, and then recognizes and realizes that Elena actually already moved on and married someone else. But then in that act of marrying someone else, she still loved Toto. It's a very weird situation.
And they had
But
passionate sex.
indeed, that is the response.
Wait, really? Really?
That's actually what happens. You hit the nail on the head. Okay, someone is calling. Give me a moment.
Okay,
Hello?
I'll think a bit more about this. So now they're
never mind.
returning.
I
So
mhm.
then what was the? I remember then in the normal cuts ending, nothing really happened, right? He went back. He looked through the old stuff. He
And
did
then
he
he
go back to his
watches,
old cinema? Yeah, he watches
and then he
old
watches the
movies.
clips of all the love, of all the
Mhm.
of all the people having passionate sex in the movies. You know, the
Rather than
parts where
himself having
the
passionate
priest
sex.
like deleted. Yes.
Oh, yeah. And how do these two? So it seems like the director's cut is almost more naive. In but
Indeed.
then it's more affirmatory of faith, whereas the
Yes.
normal cut is linked with nostalgia. I think it provides the way out, and the way out is something like. And Toto didn't move on, right? Or do you think Toto moved on?
I don't think moved on is a correct way to describe his 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 relationship to nostalgia.
Hmm.
I think that's in
Yeah, I've been thinking about this too. I don't think one necessarily moves on from love, but then it's that one assimilates it in such a way that the process of tragedy becomes a part of oneself.
Mhm.
In such a way, one does
Yes.
not throw anything away, but one takes it on. Not only
Mhm.
bears it, because bearing has the connotation of it being a burden, but one takes it on and welcomes it, and then moves forward in life with courage and with, I think, with the faith that is somehow strengthened by the experience of this tragedy.
Mhm. I think, and that's a very interesting thing, though. Though it seems like the movie doesn't necessarily offer that explanation, or the solution which is provided in the movie is it's quite strange because the life in which Toto lives at the end is one where he moves and doesn't really have an identity despite the success that he achieves in some sense, because he just moves from one relationship to another, and that, at least that's the image that is being presented, and without any concrete relationship, perhaps that could be, if that's a way of illustrating it.
Well,
But
to force my interpretation on, I want to hear what you think about this.
mhm.
Can we think of cinema Paradiso rather than as something that offers a solution? Can be more something like a cautionary tale. In that this is what
Mhm.
happens when one does not move, not one does not welcome the tragedy, nor does one move on to on tragedy. I want to stuck
Mhm.
in the past. So it's the
Mhm.
worst form of nostalgia, where there's a certain form of nostalgia where one's pushed towards the future. So one looks back at the past, one sees the wonderful things there, and it provides one the courage to go ahead into the open future, to encounter more things, like the wonderful things that one has encountered in the past. And there's another form of nostalgia, which is this prison that locks one in, and which stops one from moving into the future, into the open possibilities. And that will be the nostalgia of Toto.
I think that's actually a decent understanding, is that it doesn't offer a solution, or at least it doesn't offer any solution which is satisfactory. And that's perhaps why it's a very good tale to develop the situation in man, but it's less so able to develop the situation of, or at least the solution of man. And it perhaps leaves everyone on the cliffhanger, says, well, now here is the situation. That's the logical conclusions. Well, where exactly are we left off now? And as a result, I would say nostalgia is perhaps a part of the situation that you have to kind of think about.
And what are some of more of your thoughts on nostalgia? Maybe in relation to love, in relation to faith, in relation to works.
Well, I think nostalgia is a very good tale, but at the same time, it's something which it is the mode which allows you to recognize a tragedy, but then it isn't necessarily something which you should view in a fatalistic sense. A lot of times, I would say society looks at nostalgia as something, saying, oh, the past was better, the past was better, the past was better, and then that's just caught in the loop of looking at the past. And that doesn't allow for a creative act or a positive act moving forward. But rather, I would say nostalgia is something of the saying, I actually recognize that the past was very beautiful and very important. And it is precisely through that past which allows you to understand, or at least recognize, the good, or at least it allows you to recognize elements of the past which were vital, and then is almost kind of like the eye opener and saying, you're nostalgic about something because there were good elements there, it wasn't all evil, and now your responsibility is to look at that mess of that you're confronted with, that tragedy, and you're going to say, what actually is those elements, and maybe all those elements within it are good in themselves, and then you just have to be able to use that nostalgia as a tool to kind of figure out what on earth is at the end of it and how you can move on from it.
I really love one of your phrases where you said, like, looking back at all the tragedies. And it seems like whenever one is nostalgic about something, there's always an overwhelming sense of the tragic that permeates nostalgia, which almost characterizes nostalgia. And I'm just thinking, it seems to me that it's not even related to the content of what one is being nostalgic against, but that the very fact of nostalgia contains tragedy. And my proposal is maybe that it contains tragedy because nostalgia is always related to time, of time past and time that cannot be regained. And this leads to tragedy, and that tragedy has a similar structure of the time past, time cannot regain. And one can do everything well, one can do everything correctly, and time will still flow on. And maybe that's somehow related to the tragedy in nostalgia. What do you think? And what do you think? Why do you think nostalgia is always so tragic?
Well, because I think nostalgia is a conclusion after one has gone through, or at least recognizes a tragedy, in the sense that when one recognizes, and I mean tragedy in the truest sense, when one is conflicted by two forms of good which are both insufficient. And in that sense, it is nostalgia arises when you recognize that you've gone through all forms of good, but all of them have failed. And that leads to a nostalgic thing, because you like to think, what actually in the past did I do wrong? What actually was insufficient? What actually did mess up? Even though I did everything properly, I did everything good. And that is the question.
I want to disagree in that I don't think nostalgia requires this form of tragedy. Although I don't deny that this is a very important ingredient of tragedy, where we have two good choices, multiple good choices that are in conflict with each other, and we only choose one. To me, it almost seems like nostalgia happens no matter whether you've done the right choice or the wrong choice. No matter nostalgia the tragedy of nostalgia does not lie in making the wrong choice or even a conflict of choices, but rather it seems to me to be linked with the opposition between possibility and actuality. There we have a lot of things that we can choose to do, and we can only actualize one of them. And it doesn't matter whether there's only one good choice out of all of those possibilities, and we actualize the one correct choice, even though we did everything correctly and there was no conflict. Nonetheless, I think we will still be nostalgic, and we'll still think back, wondering about what could have been, even though what could have been is not as good as what is now.
I agree. In the sense, I would say that is also a form of nostalgia. In the sense that I'm not arguing that nostalgia only occurs from tragedy, but rather that I would say the strongest sense of nostalgia does arise from that form of tragedy. But nevertheless, nostalgia can come from other things, conflicts between good and evil, conflicts between evil, and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I would say that those forms of conflicts, and even if there wasn't a conflict at all, will also lead to nostalgia as well. But that nostalgia is less strong, or at least of a less productive kind. Because, for example, if there was only evil and you just like saying, well, oh yeah, the past was as such, that's a form of nostalgia, but in some sense it isn't a very strong sense of nostalgia because there's nothing you can do about it.
Can you give an example of your kind of nostalgia? So what would be some real life examples that one would encounter? Which forces one to confront this tragedy? And maybe you can like try to qualitatively describe what this nostalgia feels like for me to get a better sense of it.
So the strongest form of nostalgia, well, it'll be perhaps some sense of experience of love in the past. Perhaps maybe it's like this idea that you, in a very cinema paradisian sense, it's this idea that, well, you try very hard. You've tried both forms of pursuing or at least maintaining a relationship to some degree. You first of all just rely on some sense of innocence, infant interpretation of love, but then that also
sexuality.
Yes, perhaps, and in some sense you also then realize that is insufficient, and that you look at in front of you that the relationship is falling away despite that infancy and that purity of intention, perhaps. And then after that, you try to do works, but still that is insufficient to save the relationship, despite how many gifts or kind of things you try to do. And then you're left with the idea, well, nothing works at all. But then at the same time, you recognize that there is something beautiful within a relationship itself, and you want to pursue it. And in some sense, looking back at the past, the conflict between the two forms is a form of nostalgia. And at the same time, you're accepting the tragedy that neither of them in themselves are enough to maintain anything, which requires the other to work as well, perhaps.
What is the conflict within here? Because what I hear is it's tragic, but it doesn't seem to be your kind of tragedy. But it seems like two people making the wrong choices all the way. It's like being a good situation.
Now, actually, I'll disagree. I would say it is two people making the right choices along the way, but it still goes south for some extremely crazy and unknown reason. Like, it is almost this idea of, the Dostoevsky idea in Notes of Underground, where it says, even if man reaches paradise, he will still destroy it just for something strange to happen. It is precisely this idea that both parties try to do the good in all their ability, but it still fails. And they've tried it in all forms. For example, right, like the situation is such is that both sides do want the relationship to work, and both sides try, both via the infancy and then also as the maturity. But nevertheless, they fail.
And how does this link with nostalgia? What's the feeling of nostalgia related to this thing?
Well, I think the nostalgia is like, well, the nostalgic aspect is like, well, it was good to be in those moments. You like those moments. It was a good choice in both sense. It's a past. And you recognize that there is no kind of solution in the future as well. when you're saying, well, okay, I had all these choices, but I can't actually overcome any of them. In the sense of like you saying, well, okay, it would have been nice if I was able to enter into this. It would have been nice if both of them worked, but none of them worked, even though all of them were good. And that is nostalgic in the sense of, well, saying, well, all right, that was the past. That past, in the moment, I thought it would work, and it was good. But then it still ended in failure, despite it being good all the time. You went from one mode of goodness to another mode of goodness, and the conclusion was failure. I mean, it's
And
extremely ridiculous.
Okay, I can't understand here. So nostalgia would be something like looking back into the past. You encounter all of your failures, but despite all of those failures, you see the wonderful, not only potentiality, but the wonderful actual goodness contained within each of those failures. And how does that nostalgia link with the present?
The present. Well, I think that the present comes in through saying, well, how then shall we live? Like, how should we live based on this? Because the object of that conflict is something which is desirable. And you want to emulate it, or not necessarily emulate it, but think about it in some sense. But then after that, while you're trying to think about it, you don't exactly know how to, what do you call it? Encapsulate it. You don't know how to live it out, precisely because you've tried all forms of good in the past and it fails.
Sorry, can you expand on it a bit more?
For example, you want to be in that relationship, perhaps, right? You want to be in that relationship, not necessarily that relationship, but in the structure which is similar to that relationship. But being that structure fails, or at least to you, at first, it feels that it's insufficient and it's impossible, because while in the past you've tried all forms of good, and all forms of good have failed. And as a result, you constantly think about the past, saying, well, what on earth in the past went wrong? Like, where on earth did the evil or where on earth did the failure come from? Because it would be very strange to say, well, all things were good, and then suddenly failure occurred. So trying to look for that evil property is a form of nostalgia, perhaps, in the past. In the same way, I would say there is another form of nostalgia, which is the reflex of it, which is looking at all forms of evil, and you say, well, how did good come out of it? And it's trying to look for that property, which is an element of the nostalgia.
Nostalgia is looking for the good within tragedy, and by doing so, it justifies existence, because it somehow redeems tragedy in such a way. A tragedy itself shines in value.
Mm-hmm. Yes, or it could be looking for, I would say it's looking for good or evil within a conflict.
How would evil link with tragedy?
Well, I would say, well, perhaps, you know how we said, well, a possible tragedy is two goods conflicting and still leads to evil, despite all the good modes of being chosen and realized. You could also, I would say, you could also have an inverse. And it's not necessarily tragic in that sense, but it is tragic in the sense of, well, you have two evils, but for some miraculous reason, good comes out of it. And you're like, well, how on earth did that occur as well? And that's a form of tragedy as well, because in theory, it's then saying, well, can this good come only out of the evil? Or is that also plausible from the good itself?
Yeah, I like that. I think this is much more interesting than a good tragedy. It's the evil good tragedy where you do everything wrong and nonetheless you succeed. And then you look back at yourself and you don't even understand what has happened that has catapulted you into your current position. And that's maybe even a greater form of tragedy than a good tragedy where there's a conflict of the good. It's a conflict of evil that produces the good miraculously. And then you start questioning the nature of good itself. Not only you start questioning the nature of good itself, you question sort of the order of the world and your own sanity and the goodness of everything around you. And whether good you currently perceive is a good at all. And that is a true tragedy. It's a tragedy that subverts everything at the same time. Because from evil, there comes the good. And you start questioning, does good need evil? Or is this just a chance? And if this is a chance, then is the world completely made of chance rather than being chanceless? I don't know. I just made a lot of long monologue. You respond to anything.
I think it's a very good idea. It's this idea of the world being made out of chance or not. I think that might be quite a good place to end this kind of discussion on nostalgia, because I think we've reached a point of no return. Perhaps it's the end of the road in some sense.
It's like when you're having sex, and it's like at the end you're like, oh no, I need to pull out. It was like interrupted, and you couldn't do it. You can't do it.
No, that's a pure role of tragedy. Is that even though you've coitus interruptus, the person still gets traded.
No. I think there's two parts. There's two parts here. You realize that you have to go coitus interruptus, well, you just can't do it. As in, you reach the point of no return. Second, you do the coitus interruptus, and so. It is like a two form of tragedy and like subverting each other here.
Indeed. Perhaps we can answer some of the questions by our dear friend Benji, who's watched through this 1 hour of madness. I honestly do not know how on earth you withstand this, but thank you so much. We can answer some of your questions, perhaps. Does nostalgia often become an essential part of the object of nostalgia, putting it in an antinomy where it allows the possibility of its own existence, making it transcendent and reliant upon faith? What are your thoughts?
Let me think a bit about it. So now let's try to first translate the sentence. I think what Benji's saying is something like, is nostalgia, so once you experience nostalgia in a certain thing, does the nostalgia constitute that thing in such a way that the nostalgia becomes an essential part of the thing, and the thing relies on nostalgia to exist? And if the thing relies on nostalgia to exist, then the thing, we can call it transcendent and reliant on faith. Josh, would you think, would this be how you would interpret Benji's sentence?
I think that seems to be a way how to interpret the sentence, is to say that I think that is something which I'm just trying to think about the context, what we were discussing when this question was posed. I think it was very towards the beginning. So perhaps nostalgia, perhaps this form of nostalgia it was a question of what on earth we meant by nostalgia when I was linking it to tragedy. Because I would say the antinomy here is that antinomy between the two goods or two evils, which is a very strange antinomy, but seems to be a potential one, and that might be the root of the question. And perhaps we have answered this question through our last discussion.
I would say that nostalgia has a way to color everything that it sees or that it possesses in such a way that those things become primarily nostalgic objects rather than objects in themselves. And one can say that those are transcendent, and I think maybe rather than it's relying on faith, we can say that it is the condition of the possibility of faith, or these nostalgic objects make faith possible. Shall we go to the next one?
Yes, I think we should.
The book was, well, we did it ourselves voluntarily.
What are your thoughts on the Spinozist idea that nature equates to God and how it links to Berdyaev's theory? I would say Berdyaev rejects any idea or any pantheistic idea. I mean, Berdyaev would agree in some sense of pantheism to say that, well, God is being itself, and in order to reach the divine, you must go beyond the realm of the natural. And in some sense, it is the beyond. And in that sense, you'll agree with Spinoza. But at the same time, Berdyaev would disagree in the sense that God is as a person who interacts with the world and interacts with the persons of which are human beings. And as a result, there would be that difference as well. And it's not and he would disagree with any form of Spinozist kind of idea of God. Now, do you think the movie is symbolic of Nietzsche's three metamorphoses, where the child is at the final stage? I would say the child is the first stage in the movie, but in some sense you could say, well, at least in the extended version, that perhaps the child is also the final stage. That child is the first and the final stage.
The child is the product of the final stage. It goes beyond Nietzsche, in that it's not one thing becomes the child, right? But rather the child produces a child, right? And the child gets produced. If you get what I mean. And I would argue that it's not necessarily saying we can even say that Nietzsche's three metamorphoses is symbolic of the movie, rather than the movie is symbolic of Nietzsche's three metamorphoses. I think there's a tendency of people who's too philosophical to try to map literary works, artistic works, onto philosophical theory. I think a much more interesting approach is to allow art to transform philosophy, rather than using philosophy to restrain art. And one of the ways that we're doing it here is how, as Josh said, child is not only the final stage. The child is a product of the final stage. It's like this mysterious surplus that comes in the final stage as a child, out of love.
And this is what I was reading about. I've been getting a lot of insights while reading this book, The Destiny of Man by Nikolai Berdyaev. And what his discussion of, he was talking about the Oedipal complex, and he said, well, what actually makes Oedipal so ridiculous? It is precisely that the Oedipal act, the act of the incest, is the rejection of the creation and the return to the child. It's like, to him, it's like going into the world is an act of knowing the world, to make things in the world themselves. It's that act of knowing and appropriating that in the world into oneself. And it's an act of creation. It's a free act of creation out of nothingness, the creatio ex nihilo. But by going back to the mother in the Oedipal complex is precisely the idea of the rejection of any development in the future and the rejection of the life and the creation complex. It is that precise return to the child, which is the rejection. I don't even know how I've gotten to this.
Yes, I agree. I think so recently I've been meeting up with like HSPSM people, and then there's two anecdotes:
people?
Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, and Stanford. So it's like the exclusive small
copies.
all Harvard copies, and Harvard is Oxford copy. So all Oxford copy, but there's like one more stage here.
Indeed.
And there's two anecdotes worthy of relating. One is, so I was talking with one of this Princeton guy who we became good friends. Actually, only like after 2 hours of conversation. So I'm not sure whether I can call it good friends or not. But we were again talking about mothers, and he said something that really stuck with me. It's like some people they never manage to fight off their Asian mom, and it gets real ugly, you know, when they can't find himself because they're almost overwhelmed by the oceanic mother, and they can't find their own identity. And I think that's part of the Oedipal complex. And another thing, and that was related to my comment of how we shouldn't match Nietzsche's three stages onto the movie, but rather somehow allow the movie to transform Nietzsche's three stages. Again, this is a Stanford girl who also does who does A-level English, and you know how we talked with our friend, our Princeton friend in Harrow, about how phallic imagery is like a central part of A-level English teaching, where they relate everything to the phallic. I would almost say that rather than saying these poems or these literary works have the explicit intention of invoking the phallic, we can say that phallic is such an universal symbol and such a powerful tool that it is a good metaphor for everything, rather than there's any intention going on. So I believe here that the phallic it's like, let's say we can explain everything using God, not necessarily because everyone believes in God, but because God is present in everything. In the same way, I believe that the phallic is present in everything, and which is why it is so potent, even here.
Mhm. And this is why some people would say the subconscious is dictated, is ruled by the phallus, the libido. And that's a difference between Lacan, who I think is it Lacan who says the subconscious is structured like a language.
But then maybe
that
I
Levi
think he
Strauss
thinks that language
is
is structured
as a
like
phallus.
like a phallus.
Yes, I think that might be the correct conclusion. And he might be talking about some sense of underlying connection between the phallus and language, which might be possible if we were to use the metaphysical schema of the phallus as a representation of creation, and that language is
it's
the
a
mode
similar
of creation
thing.
of the
Yeah.
world. Mhm.
It's a similar thing to how Harvard copies Oxford, and then all the other U.S. colleges copies Harvard. I think it's the same way where things interpenetrate. And there's a way in which, when we're doing this representation, not only are we talking about the phallus explicitly, linking it from the unconscious to language to phallus, but rather this very active linking, this thought process itself is already phallic. So there's a twofold phallic process going on. So he's making it even more phallic by not talking about the phallus, because the phallus is the thing that disappears.
Okay. Do you think that love can be considered an object petit a, and that faith is the desire of that object petit a? You can respond to this. I am yet to read my the seminars of Jacques Lacan, the ego in Freud's theory and the technique of psychoanalysis. I am yet to read this book. I've been sitting in quarantine. I've been reading a book a day, and I'm now stuck on my Verdier, so I haven't gotten to that yet. I still have 2 books to read before I leave quarantine, I've given up on reading the drama of humanist atheism. It's a bit long, so I can't finish. I lugged it around Australia for like 2 weeks, but I'd never got around to reading it, so it's a bit of a shame.
Yeah, I feel you. It's like I always bring a book out, and I'm like, I'm going to read maybe 20 pages a day, and then I just never read that one book, but I read all other kinds of books. But
I've realized I watched a video by, and I'll tell you this analogy, then you can answer the question about me reading. Is that I was watching this video by Andrew Tate, and he said, well, I was reading, and then I did push-ups. I read 3 pages, and I did like 50 push-ups. I think that is a way to force us to read and do exercise, in the sense that you read 20 pages and then you do 50 push-ups, and then you read another 20 pages and then you do 50 push-ups. Not only does it speed up your reading, it also speeds up your push-ups. It's a reciprocal relationship.
Oh, because if you don't read 20 pages, you won't be able to do any push-ups.
Exactly. But if you aren't able to do push-ups, you wouldn't be able to read.
Okay, let's come to the object petit question.
Yeah. Okay.
I frankly don't really understand the question. I know. Let me think about this. Because I haven't read philosophy for like 2 months.
What have you been reading? Your erotica? Your Chinese erotica?
Yeah, Chinese
Is that what you've
erotica,
been
yes.
reading?
No,
Is that
mainly
the only thing
literature.
you're
Like 20 hours a day. I'm going to write my senior thesis on that. I'm going to write my senior thesis before I even enter Harvard, and I'll just take it out at the end. It's like I did exclusive research into Chinese erotica. I read maybe 500 hours. I finished everything, and now I can finally give a conclusive account of sexuality when it's suppressed. But
you know how you asked to do 2. We asked to do 2 EPQs, right? Maybe it is us asking to do 2 senior theses. Like the professor's like, it's a very difficult process. Can we do 2? We've already finished it.
We already finished our first one. Can we do the second one?
Yeah.
I like that. Okay, let me think. Is faith the desiring of that object petit a? I don't know what it means. Next one.
Okay. Is sin both a departure from faith? Why does my Siri keep on turning on? Like, it's ridiculous. Is sin both a departure
that's
from...
phallic again.
Exactly. Is sin both a departure from faith and also the excess of faith? Because Hegel thought that evil was the good, that thought of itself as completely good. What are your thoughts?
Okay. I think what Benji is basically asking is, would too much faith lead to evil? With the second part, it's a pretty famous Hegelian argument. Although that's not the totality of what Hegel thought about good. Let's go back to the first part, because the second part is sort of a description of the first part. Josh, do you think an excess of faith could lead to evil?
Well, I wouldn't exactly say what an excess of faith even means. In some sense, you could say, well, unless that faith is a dedication to faith, then I would say that leads to evil. And what I mean by that is I finally understood what on earth did they mean that free will is a destruction of the will. It's the idea of one's desire for free will leads to destruction of the will. Because in order to desire free will is already to be free, but to desire the will is to desire what you conceive of as to be free. And as a result, when someone says, I want to be free, they've already restrained themselves more than they were when they said, when they decided to say, I want to be free. And as a result, the faith is...
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat that logical process again? That's really profound, but I didn't follow.
Okay, to be free. Okay, so there's always this Dostoevskian dialectic that the pursuit of freedom is itself a restriction and leads to self-will and the destruction of freedom. Now, the reason for that to be the case is because to pursue freedom is already itself a free act. No, to pursue without caring about what it's pursuing is already a free act. And to say, I want to pursue freedom, that idea of freedom is not the act, but rather your own conception of freedom. And as a result, to pursue freedom is to say, I freely choose to pursue the freedom that I believe to be free. And as a result, you're already
limit your choices.
Conception. Exactly.
I like that. That's right.
And in the same way, the excess of faith itself is an evil. But if the excess of faith is taken to believe or taken to mean, I want to have faith in the principle of the faith that I desire or I conceive to be faith, then you are limiting faith, and as a result is a sin.
I like this. Then what's the solution, Josh, to this problem? And I'll tell my answer after you tell me the solution.
I would say the solution is to live in faith. It's just to live. And that is already the act of faith.
And shall we ever talk, or is to talk to sin already?
I would say we should talk, but rather we should talk not for faith, but from a position of faith. And that is the idea of the Berdyaev idea of the knowing. It is to appropriate the concept into one's heart. And in that sense, to talk from the position of faith is not to say faith is something separate from me, but that faith is already within me.
So we have to somehow first phallically penetrate faith in order to talk about faith.
Perhaps that would be the way to...
This is what I've been thinking. Because I told you I haven't read philosophy for like 2 months. What I've been mainly doing in the past few months is first just reading math, and I realized that it uses a similar muscle for philosophy. So I can't actually, I don't have enough energy to do philosophy. So what I've been doing is reading a lot of literature, and also just doing a ton of free associative writing. First, like before I meet people, and when I'm meeting people, after I meet people, and just observing people. My conclusion is something like...
Where do you find all these Harvard people? Actually, go on with your conclusion. I don't want to break your train of thought.
It's fine. The conclusion is... Give me a second. Oh, the conclusion for me is something like when I'm doing free association rather than sort of philosophical, logical analysis, is I'm trying to be in faith rather than talking about faith. So I'm trying to penetrate faith and allowing myself to know faith and immerse myself in faith. And for me to be in union with faith, or in union with the knowledge that I am pursuing, rather than just merely being able to talk about it. And I guess I think that's a stage that one has to go through. and what maybe you were talking about too in the mistake. And in terms of how I meet these horror people, Chinese people are very classist and casteist. So so once you're in a certain caste, like they just start pursuing you basically. And they back, and also because there's only let's say 7 people who go into Harvard in mainland China. So it's a very small community. And in terms of the HYPSM, which is the sort of the unique class in Chinese US college circles, the way they don't it's really funny because they don't interact with any other colleges, even though there are colleges that are really, oh shit. And what they do is like moms just start contacting other moms, and this is this sort of bottom up distributive network where moms just start contacting other moms, and everyone ends up in the same WeChat group with like 100 moms, and the moms start organizing things. And after moms start organizing things, you get the kids meeting the kids, and then the kids themselves start like bottom up distributive organizing with other kids. But coming back to Benji's question, I'd say that this is the wrong question to ask, and that's why it was so hard to answer. Because faith itself is an excess, so there's no excess of faith. You're asking, can you live too much? That's the same question, right? Because living is really too much.
Okay, now, is nostalgia autonomous or heteronymous? I think that's just purely in Kantian. It's the Kantian appropriation of that which is non-Kantian, I would say. What are your thoughts?
I think we need a broader concept. I think you're right. Probably the autonomous heteronymous distinction, which is the difference between doing something, willing something by my own will alone, and willing something being corrupted by desire from my will. That's the distinction between autonomous, which is willing by will alone, and heteronymous. I say here that nostalgia points out the insufficiency of autonomy. With nostalgia, I think when you think about it, it's not necessarily you will nostalgia. When nostalgia comes to you, inhabits you, forces itself upon you, encrusts itself upon you. And as it does so, you achieve a higher state of enlightenment, being forced upon rather than forcing upon things. And that's the problem with Kant, and that's why I think that's where the feminist critique is correct. That there is a certain masculine assumption around traditional concepts of philosophy that one should one should dissolve and rethink. And one of it is autonomy, where you're pushing into things rather than allowing things to push into you.
Indeed. I think that okay, in this will be the last question before we end off this chat. In my question about objectivity, I guess I was asking whether love is a desired object that acts as a driving force for its own existence, or whether faith is a driving force for love.
Love is a desired object. Josh, what do you think?
I'm not sure, actually. I would say that I think I would avoid saying that love is something which drives itself, and I would perhaps say that in this circumstance the distinction is insufficient, or at least unhelpful, in the sense that you should view love as something which exists almost causa sui, of its own nature. And of course, that would say it acts as the driving force of its own existence, but I wouldn't say it acts as the driving force of anything, but rather it simply just exists. It's sui generis. It's of its own kind. And that to say that and to say that it requires something else to drive it, or even requires itself to drive itself, would be incorrect. If you got what I mean.
I agree. Yeah, you're right.
Boom. Okay.
Are we
On
supposed
that
Are we
note,
supposed to tell like another phallus joke before we leave, or?
all right. Do you have any phallus jokes that you've read, you've obtained from reading Chinese erotica?
No, we can make a really easy phallus joke here. No.
Okay. And you've lagged. Has he frozen? I suppose he has frozen. Or maybe his frozen nature is a result of his... He does actually look like a phallus. I suppose that is the phallus joke, isn't it? All right. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Enjoy this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching. And goodbye. I'll see you next one.